Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Karlie and Brooke show. I'm Karlie.
And I'm Brooke, and today we're going to talk about establishing time in your novel. So when you start your novel, you should have your time period established in the very first chapter. And we're going to talk about some different ways on how you can do that. Yeah, and some of the examples that we have are like Ready Player One, Cinder, and Handmaid's Tale, where the time period is very futuristic. And so in the first chapter, you'll see things dropped, like the technology that they're using, like the place that they're living in. It's all like dropped in the world building as you're dumped into this new world, this futuristic world. You can tell right from the very first chapter, what time period you're in. And sometimes, like with The Handmaid's Tale, it's both futuristic and kind of more of a, what would you call it, Karlie?
It's like, yeah, I mean, it's like that dystopian world where it's like it takes place in the future, but it feels very like old school because they're back to like those very first type of like no electricity. The way that they cook is everything from scratch. Like they're very like old school in that kind of way. So it has like that historical feel to it, but it takes place in the future.
Ooh,
So
I'd be curious actually. What did you see in Handmaid's Tale that showed that it was more futuristic, even though it had these traditional historic?
I guess like not futuristic, but definitely set like an R time period for sure, at least. Just because of their transportation, they still have vehicles, and like once you get into Canada, you see that it's very much like 2022, or even I don't know if it's somewhere a little ahead of 2022, or even like, but it's very much like in the 2000 or 20 whatever decade that we're in. But I guess it's not necessarily too futuristic where you have like stuff that technology that we don't have.
Yeah. Yeah, like with Ready Player One, I mean, you're introduced to the main character. He's living in like a vehicle that's stacked on top of other vehicles, right? And it all feels very like dystopian. And then he goes into the game, and like the technology of the game itself, especially, is very futuristic, and that's established so quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's like right when you have like your chapter one, you want to like incorporate like your technology or the lack of technology. And that again is like with your world building. So like right in the beginning paragraphs, like if you're talking like if your character has a cell phone or if they're getting into a vehicle or if there's turning on a light switch, like we kind of then have an idea of like where we're set at, or if they're talking or like referencing to texting or social media, like we'll kind of have more of an idea of like where we're at. But if it's very more historical, if you're talking about like having chamber pots in the bedroom or like wood burning stoves or like candles, then it's going to give it a total different feel. And we'll know that we're like set back in time.
Uh-huh. And then there are some books where they switch from, back in time to like the present, or, vice versa. I'm actually reading The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue right now. I'm almost done with it. And it starts with Addie LaRue in like present day New York. And she describes the apartment building, and she describes like the piano, and she describes, recording, music with this guy that she's just woken up beside. And you can tell that it's very modern. Like she's in New York. And then the next chapter, it goes back to where she's in France. And like, how old is she supposed to be? 300 years before. And so it talks about her life there, what the village was like. She doesn't have TV, she doesn't have like music that can be recorded. She's the music of, or the art that she resorts to is just sketching, or using charcoals or something like that. And so you see the contrast between the two. So I thought that was really fascinating. So she essentially did that twice. Like, here's this setting and here's this setting. And I felt like it came very naturally in the world building, because the world building, I mean, it was technically our real world, but especially in a fantasy novel, like if your world building is well enough, or is done well enough, and you're sprinkling things in naturally, it'll come
Mm-hmm.
naturally through your first chapter.
Exactly. Yeah. And that comes with just, yeah, researching your location, like where your book takes place, and researching, like, obviously the decade, the era that it takes place. And then that will, when you do your world building, it'll all kind of fall into place. Now, of course, if you have something set in a different world or in a fantasy world, you can use these same techniques, but you'll also have to touch base on like as far as like what their transportation is, what their seasons are like, what their animals, creatures are like. It kind of gets more in depth, but that's a whole different topic. But
Mm-hmm.
incorporating, like those technologies will and lack of technology will definitely set the reader and ground the reader. And you want the reader to feel grounded in chapter 1. If they don't feel grounded pretty quick off, that's where you risk losing them or having them put the book down. They need to know like where they're at, what the point is, like what the character is kind of doing, and really understand like kind of what direction the story is going to go in.
Yeah. Chapter 1 is expensive real estate.
It is, yeah. And you don't have a ton of real estate, so there's a lot that you have to do in a short amount of word count.
For sure. And the other thing that you can do is establishing like language and jargon to show where they're from, what decade they're from. It's best not to overdo it. Sometimes I'll just sprinkle in a couple words here and there that maybe people wouldn't say over here, but they would say in this time period. Sometimes, like in olden days, people might use like more archaic words. They might not use contractions. So you can eliminate contractions, but you have to be very careful about that because you don't want it to be annoying to the reader, and you don't want you want it to come across as purposeful and not just thrown in there. It can very easily come off annoying. So I mean, always my recommendation with that is to try tweaking it to see how it works for you, and then see what your beta readers say. Pass it off to your beta readers and see if they think that it works or if it doesn't.
Yeah, and just like doing it, like sprinkling it in there, like a few words, like if you're in England and they're calling each other mate or they're saying cheers, like just like little key phrases like that can make all the difference and really kind of set the scene. And that can be really easy. You don't have to overdo it, and you don't have to like use like full on where it's like more accents and where that can come off offensive. You're actually just using words that these countries will actually use, and that can just add a whole different other layer to it. But yeah, you don't want to overdo it.
One thing too, when you do that, is make sure that you have your audience in mind. Because I mean, this is an example that I throw out one time. One time I was beta reading for somebody, and they had their novel set in like Russia, like it was a fantasy world that was based off of like historic Russia. And she used modern language for her characters, and somebody else in our beta reading group did not like that. He felt like it was not very true to historic Russia.
Wow.
But I didn't mind it at all because I could read it really well. And I have a feeling that if she had sent it to other teens, because her audience were teenagers and I read a lot of YA fantasy, if she had sent it to other teens, they probably would not have liked the historic, language, the dialogue. They wouldn't have kept up with that very well.
Wow.
So, keeping your audience in mind and, listen to what your beta readers say, but don't just take everything that they say, and incorporate. Make sure that you're filtering through your beta readers' feedback, deciding if that's the right choice for your audience, and then incorporate that into your book.
Yeah, that's great. And that's like where beta readers can be so useful, and especially too, if you are going to use language or like jargon or like any kind of accents too, like sensitivity readers are going to be really important for that too. Because you don't want to come off offensive at all.
Yeah, especially if you're not from, if you're not from Russia.
Exactly. Yeah. If it's not your culture, definitely. All right. So our next one on the list is you can show readers objects from this time period, such as like the clothing or the tools that they used or the food that they're eating. And so like if you're walking into a kitchen, let's say like if you're like more, I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I'm thinking like more like 50s, it's going to be like more gas stoves. And then as you get more into like the 90s or like the early 2000s, it can be more like electric stoves. And then, kind of more back to gas stoves. Or if it's like before any of that, it could be like a wood burning stove or, there's different ways that you can add in tools that people used for cooking back then, and food too. But if depending on where your location, where your book takes place at, food is another thing that you need like a sensitivity reader for, because food can have different meanings, special meanings to the culture. So you'll have to make sure that you're doing your due diligence on researching that. But like clothing, same thing. Like you can talk about the clothing that they wore, if they're wearing more like dresses and if they have corsets on and like the heavy layers. I mean, that's going to give it a total different vibe than if you're putting people, in jeans or baggy sweatshirts or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that I've used it in the past. I was doing some research. It depends on whether you're writing like nonfiction, memoirs, or fantasy or fiction. So if you're doing nonfiction and memoirs, a lot of this, like, you could probably throw in a lot of that and linger on it and talk about it, and that will work and be cool. But in fantasy, you want to make sure that you mention it as part of your world building, but you don't linger on it too long, or your readers might get bored.
Mm-hmm.
But like, you could throw it in as your descriptions, or some of your action beats, and have your characters doing something with a chamber pot, emptying the chamber pot, whatever. I know in the Curse of Macquarie, which is the book that I'm trying to get out right now, I did some research on the era that I was writing about, and I found out that they put like linseed oil on their drapes. So I mentioned that like once in passing, just to add some nerdy historical like things in there, but I don't linger on it very long, and I don't mention it more than once. So you have to, and even if my beta reader was reading through it and was like, I don't know why you add this in here, like, just take it out.
Yep. That's what's nice, is you got the delete button.
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, that was good advice. Mm-hmm. And like another option too, like you can do is you can add in like pop culture trends to kind of set the scene. Again, you want to be careful not to overdo this, but if you're talking about like poodle skirts, so you're talking about like when the Beatles were at like their peak, or if you're talking about, I mean, there's a whole different, like the flapper era. I mean, there's different like pop culture trends that you can touch base on too, just to kind of set the era.
Yeah. And obviously not overdoing that too much too, but it reminds me of Ready Player One, because Ready Player One uses a ton of pop culture, but it's not set in the 80s. It's set in the future, but it's them going back and revisiting the 80s, but there's pop culture all over that.
I think that like when you have like, if you think like Back to the Future too, like when you are going back, I think they kind of in purpose like overdo it, because it's really setting the scene. But I guess if you're like book, I don't know if it takes place there, like I guess it really depends on the genre. If you're like doing like that Ready Player One, or that setback, going back to the future, like people, they want that 80s vibe, that like what was really popular back then. So
that becomes less of like description and world building and more plot device.
Yeah, it has a whole different purpose to it.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing is like historical events, like something that maybe is happening that same year. World War II, mentioning World War II going on at the same time, or historical events that people will know and will be able to, this is about this time period.
Yeah, and you can just, I mean, research your history for that, but I mean, like you can touch on like when women weren't allowed to vote. You can talk about who was president during that time, and so there's so many different ways that you can research or reference historical events, even like natural disasters too, earthquakes, twisters, whatever that takes place in your location.
Like your character sees like a newspaper article, or notices somebody watching TV, something like that.
Yep, lots of options.
News anchor pops up.
Yeah,
like, and then geography, how the world looked during that decade, landmarks. My son has been researching Pompeii right now. He loves the story of Pompeii, which is kind of morbid, but but I mean, you could talk about like Pompeii when it still had its tip, and you set your book in Pompeii. You could talk about how like the mountain still has its tip. Your characters probably wouldn't know that it ever wouldn't have a tip, but I mean, they could mention like the cool peak of that mountain, and then the water, like but that's just an example.
Yeah, that's a good example. Like little things like that really add extra layers to your story. And then you can also you can try and like find ways, and I guess actually going back to this one, but like an example too, like with the Paris, like in Notre Dame, like if you are talking about like the Notre Dame not being there or being burnt down, then the reader's going to know like it took place before like April 15th in 2019. So there's like little ways that you can, an awful day, but so you can find like ways to reference like horrible situations like that, or like in different ways that different landmarks, got destroyed or whatever, to set the decade and set the time period.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you can find ways to slip in the date if they're looking at a newspaper or looking at a letter or whatever, just so that they really know. But you still really need to make sure that you're doing your research on your location and your time era. Like, you don't want to just rely on the date to like let the reader know. You need to make sure that what you're describing in your descriptions are also setting the date and setting the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And even like if you use like it's just an historical era to set the tone for your fantasy world, there are things that you can pull from to give the feeling of the time period. Like I know in Empire of Glass and Stone, I used rugs and tassels in my very first chapter to set the tone and the scene, and give the reader a feeling of like what, even though it's not like a real world in a real time period, like what the time period they should be imagining is.
That's great. That's perfect. That's such a good example of how to do that.
Yeah. And they were living in tents. So like those were like all little key details that I sprinkled in the first chapter.
Like those like little key details. And like, too, this is not necessarily having to do with establishing time, but like with your key details, like if you're describing stuff, if you just start like listing like, oh, it was a tall gray building, had gray bricks, whatever, 2 doors, like that doesn't really like paint a vivid picture. So you can tie like emotions to it and like have it like, you can't do that with every description, but you can tie more emotion to it and have it like remind your character or something, just to give it more meaning and to point, like just to do more work with your world building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see.
So I'm like, I feel like that's kind of all we got here. If we have anything else we want to touch base on, Brooke.
I don't think so. Let's see. Yeah, and one thing that you mentioned in your notes, Karlie, is emotion. I think using like historical things, historical objects, historical events to bring emotion. Like our biggest job as a writer is conveying emotion. And so anytime that you can use those things to add emotion to what you're writing is always a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I wish I had a good example of that.
But I'm trying to think. I was trying to do the same thing. Like I can't pull one off the top of my head.
Like I felt like in The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, when she's playing on the piano, it's very like whimsical, almost sad, and like there wouldn't have been a piano in like in Paris where she grew up 300 years ago, but she's reflecting back on her life that no one remembers. And how she hasn't made any like impact, like she has made impacts on the world, but nobody sees them. And her sitting on that piano playing has a punch to it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. It hits you different.
Yeah. Yep.
That's when you got like a good writer. That's like what you need to put in your writing. It's hard to do, but once you do it, you can definitely pull an emotional reader, like pull on the reader's heartstrings a little bit.
Oh yeah.
It takes talent.
In The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue will do that. Definitely need to talk about that book more.
I haven't read it. I guess I need to. You've given me a few book recommendations today.
Yes, Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. If you want to do a study on metaphors, that's a good one, especially. But yeah, she does a great job of pulling emotion through objects, historical events, through metaphors, through characters reflecting back on things that have happened in their lives. Like she does a great job. It's just jam-packed full of emotion.
Wow. I'll have to check it out.
And emotion doesn't always mean tears.
Yeah. No, it just means that you felt something.
Yeah, you feel something, and that's what every book should do.
Yes. Absolutely. Make you feel something.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Cool. Is that all we got for today then?
I think so.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Be sure to check out our Instagram and TikTok, and you can find where we post daily tips on writing and talk about books and all other sorts of stuff on there. Be sure to say hi in the comments and ask any questions that you have. And be sure to subscribe, like, comment, and ring the bell. And be sure to join us next week for when we talk about more writing tips.
One more thing that I want to add. If you like this format, this is the first time that we've done a discussion, just the two of us.
Yes.
Two of us. We would love your feedback. So please comment with, did you like this format? Should we do more like this? And we want to hear from you.
Kind of more open podcast, kind of open discussion. And yeah, if you ever have any questions, just drop them in the comments and we will be sure to answer them back.
Okay. Thanks for joining in.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.